Outlast is a horror game released by independent game development studio Red Barrels in 2013. The game was incredibly successful on release and has cemented itself as one of the greatest horror games ever made. Despite its great success, the gameplay is rather simple, taking all weapons from the player and giving them only a night vision camera to navigate the darkness at Mount Massive Asylum. Though the gameplay is simple, I think there is something very complex and compelling that Red Barrels is doing with this game. It is my opinion that Red Barrels is, very subtly, conducting a kind of experiment on the player, wanting their game to be a transformative experience for the player. I think that the game does this primarily through how its characters are depicted and through the intentionally simple gameplay. In exploring these elements, I will seek to answer the question, what is the real experiment in Outlast? So Outlast is one of my favorite horror game franchises. I've put countless hours into all of the games they've developed, 100%ed all of them. That includes the stupidly difficult Energizer and Bow Whistler achievement in this game, and the somehow even more stupidly difficult Messiah achievement in Outlast 2. And I've also engaged with much of the supplemental material from the comics to other breakdown videos on YouTube. I love these games, clearly. Not just because they are probably still the scariest experience I've had with a piece of horror media, but also because they explore rich themes and difficult subject matter other games don't seem to be exploring, at least as far as I know. Before I analyze these things, I want to give a brief recap of the game's story. I will go more in depth on the different story elements throughout this essay, so this will be a pretty bare bones recap just to remind some folks that haven't played the game in a while the general events. This is primarily an analysis of the game's story rather than a recap of it. Once I've recapped the story, I'll go into how these elements work to bring about this transformative experience I believe Red Barrels is seeking to elicit from the players, and again seek to answer the question, what is the real experiment in Outlast? The game begins with Miles Upshur driving up to the very ominous looking Mount Massive Asylum. The game establishes the reason he's visiting this very ominous looking asylum. A whistleblower, who I'm sure we'll never hear about again and won't have a whole game DLC dedicated to him, has made Miles aware of horrible things being done by the Murkoff Corporation at Mount Massive, imploring Miles to bring this to the public eye. We learn that Miles is press, actually a freelance journalist, and then we equip ourselves with his famous night vision camera. Miles then enters the asylum, sees it seems not to be operating as normal, and then things escalate rapidly. Miles sees a bunch of decapitated heads and a soldier on a pike who warns Miles of the variants, establishing you can't fight them, and even if you tried, well, this soldier ended up like he did, so realistically, what hope do you have? All you've got is a night vision camera. Then, you're thrown through a window by a wildly hulking, deformed man named Chris Walker. Then, right after you regain consciousness, you're given a divine mission by someone dressed as a priest. This quote-unquote priest, whose name is Father Martin, will go on to keep you from escaping the asylum by drugging you because he really wants you to be a witness for his quote-unquote God. He will show you some rather mysterious footage of what he claims to be this god, throwing around soldiers like it's nothing. Really intimidating. From there, you will do various things from getting keycards to running from totally naked twins to losing fingers in the most horrific way I can imagine, all with the goal of both escaping the asylum and also filming the horrific things taking place there with the hopes of exposing Murkoff. As Miles moves further into the depths of this place, the player learns what is really going on. Murkoff has been using the asylum and its patients to conduct experiments with hopes that one of the patients will experience enough trauma that they will be a proper host for something called the Walrider. More about this later. Miles shuts down the experiment, seems to have saved the day, but ultimately does not achieve the goal of leaving the asylum alive. At least, not really. And therefore is not able to expose Murkoff. On the bright side, though, Miles went through enough trauma to be an appropriate host for the Walrider, so there's that. The game ends with apparently Miles being shot, then transforming into the Walrider, killing the soldiers that just shot at him and the head scientist behind the experiments. And that's how the game ends. Kind of a nutty downer ending, but that is sort of Red Barrel's style. Anyways, with that story recap out of the way, how does this story, which I was able to summarize pretty quickly, amount to anything worth analyzing? Isn't it just another crazy gore fest? Isn't it just another game overly reliant on cheap jump scares? Isn't it just another mindless horror game, as mindless as the torsos Chris Walker just ripped the heads off of? Well, I don't think it is. Again, I think the game wants to be a transformative experience for the player, and by looking at how its characters are depicted and how the gameplay is utilized, we can figure out what the game is about, and again, figure out what the real experiment of Outlast is. To start out, I want to analyze what role the characters play in the ideas the game is exploring. By looking at these characters and how they compare to one another, we will begin to see what I think the main theme of the game is, that being the exploitation of the powerless by the powerful. I want to look first at the Murkoff Corporation, as I think they best embody this theme. The Murkoff Corporation is depicted as a pretty blatantly evil corporation. This is made clear by that first document referenced earlier that was sent by the whistleblower, who, again, definitely won't have a whole game dedicated to him that is somehow even more horrific than this one. This is made even more explicit with one of the journal entries that Miles Upshur will write. If you hold your camera up to record certain things or events throughout the game, Miles will write in his journal, giving some insight into the game and the character's reaction to it. In this entry, he writes, "Murkoff's longtime MO has been to profit off the exploitation of supposed charity. Fuck the third world and bankroll another billion." This quote shows us two important things about Murkoff. First, we learn that their bottom line is the bottom line, and that they're willing to make their money off the backs of the third world, off of the powerless. Second, we learn that they mask their exploitative actions as charity, a kind of radical hypocrisy. But hey, maybe you don't trust Miles' word on the subject, or this mysterious whistleblower figure. Maybe you need something like a primary source that confirms all of this. Well, you're in luck, because you'll be able to find several of these primary sources throughout the game in the form of evidence documents. Many of these documents reveal just how evil Murkoff is. There is a document you can find pretty early on in the game that best exemplifies this. In correspondence between two Murkoff employees, we can read, "The profit potential of Project Walrider remains staggeringly high. 4 fatalities. As with the others, however, family and the government's interest in the patients is so low as to make any chance of legal action vanishingly unlikely." This document confirms in so many words the true character of the corporation. First, it brings up the mysterious Project Walrider, something that is at the center of this game and the horrors that take place. Second, it makes abundantly clear that Miles and the whistleblower's assessment of Murkoff is accurate. They are willing to conduct human experiments that end up with fatalities, and they make sure that those experiments are on nobodies, the forgotten of society, the powerless. With this setup, the game begs the question, what exactly is the experiment being done at Mount Massive? What do they hope to achieve, or as Miles puts it, how did Murkoff think they would make money off a building full of crazy people? Well, as stated before, Project Walrider is at the center of all of this. As you progress through the game, the man who is dressed like a priest, Father Martin, guides you to a movie theater. Unfortunately, he doesn't play like the new Marvel movie or something. Instead, it's an exit interview by someone named Dr. Rudolf Wernicke, the aforementioned head scientist behind the experiments at Mount Massive Asylum. It would turn out that this Dr. Wernicke is an ex-Nazi scientist brought over to the United States by what is called Operation Paperclip. Now, this is actually a real-life thing in which the US government utilized the expertise of war criminal Nazi scientists, lest they fall into the hands of the Russians. Wernicke, while in Germany, conducted similar experiments to the ones being done at Mount Massive. Wernicke will go on to explain what is required for this experiment to work, and we begin to see the reprehensible lengths Murkoff is willing to go in order to make a profit. Wernicke explains that the experiment needed
proximity to death, to overwhelming madness. Only a test subject who had witnessed enough horror was capable of activating the engine.
It was Murkoff's prerogative then to achieve this needed level of horror by exposing the patients of Mount Massive, folks who have already likely experienced the great trauma already, to unimaginable torture in order to activate the morphogenic engine. If Murkoff was successful, they would be able to create something called the Walrider. The successfully compatible host would fall into a lucid dreaming state in which they would be able to control the Walrider, this conglomeration of nanobots. This being would be capable of unprecedented levels of destruction, which explains a lot of the immense levels of death and destruction seen at Mount Massive Asylum. It also explains why Murkoff is so interested in all of this. If they are successful, they would be able to sell this death machine to the military and make a fortune. Their greed seemed to have blinded them to the danger of this experiment going wrong, however, thus the situation Miles finds himself in at this moment. I think the reality of Murkoff's blind greed is put best by Wernicke himself.
Murkoff knew the danger, and they didn't care. In the corporation's mind, they were all just dollar amounts in a ledger.
Let's then shift our focus to those patients that Murkoff took advantage of, as I think that these patients, or variants as the game will call them, do a lot of work in setting up the themes of the game, even if Murkoff maybe is the best embodiment of the theme of the exploitation of the powerless by the powerful. The main reason for this is that Murkoff is more of a background presence, a sort of puppet master pulling the strings, but are less concretely involved in the events of the game. The variants, however, are present throughout the game and are the main characters and threats the player will be forced to interact with. So how then do the variants explore this theme? Well, I think through the way the variants are both victims and monsters. They both reveal the evils of Murkoff while also participating in the same sort of violence Murkoff is guilty of. If Project Walrider shows anything, it shows that the Murkoff Corporation is willing to take advantage of the powerless for their own selfish ends, and who are more powerless than these mentally ill patients. Not only are they powerless before external forces being committed to this asylum, but internal ones as well, being victims of their own dwindling sanity. As Miles will write in his journal midway through the game, I'm not the only victim here, not by a long shot. Project Walrider is in line with the previously stated MO of the Murkoff Corporation, to make a profit from the suffering of the helpless, the patients that are at Mount Massive Asylum. Many of the variants are truly victims of Murkoff's corporate greed. Just visually, this is made abundantly clear. The kinds of scarring and deformations that can be seen among the variants are horrifying to look at. From missing eyes to missing limbs to worse, their inhuman appearance is a visual reminder of the way that Murkoff has treated them, as less than human. However, there are some that are not just victims of violence, but perpetrators of it as well, and there's no better example than Richard Traeger. There is very little complexity in Traeger's motives. He simply likes to be powerful, and he shows his power through violence, not unlike the Murkoff Corporation. You can find different documents that illustrate his similar mindset to that of the Murkoff Corporation. One of the first that have something to do with Traeger is one written by the man himself. In it, Traeger writes, "Somebody's got to cut the fat from this Project Walrider disaster. I've managed to slim back the personnel by more than 80 people, which means short-term savings in salary and long-term savings in pension and healthcare costs." Here, Traeger speaks like an executive in how he is concerned with the bottom line, and he seeks to gain a profit by cutting back the personnel. As Miles explores the mail ward, it becomes clear that those 80-plus people were not fired, but murdered, which is not really that far off from what Murkoff themselves have done with the Project Walrider experiment. What is Traeger up to exactly that is resulting in so many deaths? The answer further ties Traeger to the actions of the Murkoff Corporation. In the same document referenced earlier that was written by Traeger, we see that he is playing doctor. And I've been figuring out a lot about biology. I was on the fence about it before, but now I can say with absolute certainty that a person can't live without his kidneys. You learn something new every day. As you explore his realm, the male ward, you see more examples of how he seems to be conducting unnecessary experiments on the variants that only result in death and suffering. Again, not too far off from what Murkoff themselves have done. His role thematically is being a microcosm of what Murkoff is doing more broadly. This is made even more explicit by the fact that he was employed by the Murkoff Corporation in the past as the head of business development at Mount Massive Asylum. This is hinted at by different documents in the game, but made explicit by the Murkoff account comics released by Red Barrels on their website. His time being employed by Murkoff would come to an end, it turns out, when Traeger would be accused of rape by one of his co-workers and would then act to kill the accuser and her baby to deal with this inconvenience. Ironically, his actions would make him an inconvenience to Murkoff, as his actions might result in more scrutiny than the corporation was ready for. So he is forcefully committed to Mount Massive Asylum to cover up his actions. It is made worse for him in that he is forced to be a candidate for the Project Walrider experiment, the very experiment he played a role in. We see that though Traeger may have been a victim of Murkoff, he was by no means a good man before, and was in fact quite despicable. The experiments, if anything, simply amplified this evil already present in him. Other variants are a little less straightforward though. Two more variants I also wanted to parallel to the Murkoff Corporation and their activities are the twins. They compare with Murkoff in that they mask their violent intentions with a demeanor of kindness and gentleness. I think this is also true of Father Martin, but I think that the twins represent this more explicitly. The first thing you will likely notice about them when you are introduced to them is that they are totally naked. I think this is both present to shock, but also present as a representation of hypocrisy laid bare. Again, in this initial introduction to the twins, you hear them talking about you. Their dialogue is interesting for a few reasons. Firstly, the voice actor does a really great job at making them sound calm and almost gentle, while this is juxtaposed with their horrific appearance. This juxtaposition of gentleness and violence is also present in what they actually say.
I would like to kill him.
As would I.
The preacher asked us not to.
It would be impolite.
Not here.
They talk about not wanting to risk being impolite, and yet they are also talking about killing Miles, and will discuss keeping his tongue and liver as souvenirs of their kill, which is absolutely vile, by the way. This same kind of juxtaposition can be found later on as they compare their ability to suppress their desires to kill for a few moments to the righteousness of the biblical figure named Job.
That we did.
I'd say we were more than there.
Paragons of patience.
Job-like in the suppression of our desires.
But now we indulge.
Yes.
They mask their vile intentions with an air of religiosity and kindness. Though they say they want to respect Father Martin's wishes and refrain from killing Miles, this pretense drops very quickly, as there are many occasions in the game in which you can be killed by them. Again, they represent a kind of hypocrisy laid bare, the same kind of hypocrisy that Murkoff is guilty of. They pretend to be charitable, but they are anything but charitable. The kindness they present is a mask for their true violent and predatory intentions. Moving on from the twins, I wanted to finish up my character analysis with one of the major variants in the game, Chris Walker. I wanted to end with him because I think in discussing Chris Walker, we can also explore Miles Upshur and his role as being diametrically opposed to Murkoff in the values he embodies. I think that Chris Walker is the most interesting foil for Miles in the game. A foil exists to deepen the audience's understanding of the protagonist through direct comparison. Though Murkoff and the other violent variants are good foils for Miles in that they are total opposites to Miles, Chris Walker is more interesting to me as a foil because though there are obvious differences, there are similarities between Chris and Miles as well. Now, that probably sounds crazy, but just let me explain. There are a few surface level similarities. For example, there is a connection between the two characters' pasts. In the Murkoff account comics referenced earlier, you learn a bit about Chris Walker's past. He served the United States as a military policeman sometime before and was stationed in Afghanistan. This experience had a negative impact on his life, leading to PTSD and a less than healthy coping mechanism, his trademark decapitating. It was this that led to his incarceration at Mount Massive Asylum. Now, Chris Walker's past parallels Miles' past in a few ways. According to the Outlast wiki, Miles used to work as a regular journalist for an unknown company. He would go on to post material regarding the situation in Afghanistan sometime before. Not only was Miles also in Afghanistan, but his actions in Afghanistan also had a negative impact on his life, as the things he posted would end up getting him fired. His being fired resulted in being forced to work as a freelance journalist, which would eventually be the reason he comes to be trapped in Mount Massive Asylum in the first place. Starting to see the parallels? The parallels go deeper than just a similar set of experiences in their past that led them to arriving at Mount Massive Asylum, though. In a twisted way, both characters are attempting to stop Murkoff. I know, but again, hear me out. The first hint we get at Chris Walker's motive in the game is an early interaction you can spot between Chris and the guard at Mount Massive Asylum. And it's kind of what you expect. Chris is ripping his head off. Nothing out of the ordinary there, but what is interesting is what he says right after this. The question is, contain what? A journal entry from Miles further elaborates on this. Miles writes a journal entry about Chris. I hear him muttering about security protocols, containment. What if he's not the problem? What if he's trying to fix it? It seems that because of Chris Walker's past as a military policeman during the war, he is actually trying to employ what he learned in the service and contain what Murkoff is doing at the asylum. It seems he is trying to make sure that the Walrider experiment is unsuccessful. How is he doing this? Well, not in the best way possible. He is killing anyone he deems a potential host for the Walrider, thus the whole decapitation thing. In this, we see further how Chris parallels Miles. Chris wants to do the right thing by stopping Murkoff, but his gruesomely violent methods ultimately align him with Murkoff. In comparing the two characters, we see why Miles is the hero of the story. He's not stooping to adopting the methods of the Murkoff Corporation. He is not fighting violence with violence in the way Chris Walker does. Miles does not kill his enemies, and yet he still strives to take down the Murkoff Corporation. And again, this is what makes him the hero of the story. This brings us to the next aspect of this game that will help us answer the question of what is the real experiment in Outlast, the intentionally simple gameplay. I'll start first with the aspect I was starting to allude to in the analysis of Miles' character, the lack of combat. I will then move to the second most impactful part of the gameplay, the presence of the night vision camera. The lack of combat in the Outlast games seems to be one of the more controversial parts of the game. With other immensely popular horror titles like Resident Evil and Silent Hill boasting oftentimes complex combat systems, Outlast's gameplay might seem to lack depth in comparison. But I would argue that this lack of depth, though seemingly out of necessity due to the devs' limitation at the time, is a choice that enhances, not holds back the horror experience present in Outlast. I think that the lack of combat enhances the main theme of the game. Again, the exploitation of the powerless by the powerful. How does it do this? Well, put simply, it makes the player feel powerless. The game wants you to feel vulnerable, wants you to feel frustrated over your inability to fight back, your feelings of having very little agency over your situation, because that's exactly how the variants feel at Mount Massive Asylum, being helpless before the Murkoff Corporation's exploitation of them. By putting the player in these situations in which you can't fight back, it puts the idea of powerlessness on full display. By disallowing the player to fight back against Chris Walker as you watch him rip your head from your torso, you go through the same kind of violent death far too many variants experienced at the hands of the Murkoff Corporation. As you sit helpless, tied to your chair, as Richard Traeger cuts off your fingers with bone shears, you go through the same kind of horrific torture the variants went through during the Project Walrider experiments. As you flee desperately in the dark from the unimaginably powerful Walrider, you experience the same kind of hopelessness that far too many variants experienced during their incarceration at Mount Massive Asylum. In putting the player in this role of powerlessness, the player not only sees the results of what happens when the powerful exploit the powerless, but they go through it themselves. Having the player experience these things helps to drive home what I think the main theme of the game is. The other important gameplay mechanic that helps to more fully immerse the player in this powerless role is the presence of the night vision camera. The camera, to me, is a very interesting gameplay mechanic in that it emulates the found footage genre. What found footage movies can achieve is the illusion that what you are watching is not a fictional movie with a director and several cameramen, but a real-life event that just happened to be caught on camera. These kinds of movies, if done well, hope to immerse the audience more fully in the world being observed. Outlast has the added advantage of being a video game, and a first-person point-of-view video game no less. Unlike a film or book, you are not watching or reading about things happening to a character, but to differing degrees you are the character that the events of the game are happening to, and you are the one that has to push forward despite what might be lurking in the dark. The presence of the camera heightens this immersion, creating a level of immersion and empathy that arguably can't be achieved in the same way by other kinds of media. You identify more closely with the character of Miles Upshur because, in a way, you are that character. This is kind of a tangent, but I think that immersion is clearly a priority for Red Barrels. The camera as a framing tool achieves this, but I also think that the lack of an obvious identity for Miles Upshur also works to achieve this. A lack of face for the protagonist, as well as him having no spoken dialogue, makes it easier for the player to see themselves as the avatar they are controlling, and to really feel as though they are experiencing the things the character is going through in the game. Why is all this important? Well, because of my claim that Red Barrels, through the game Outlast, is performing a kind of experiment on the player. Now, this may sound out there, but there are a few moments in the game that got me thinking along these lines. There are a few lines of dialogue in particular that indicate that an experiment of sorts is being conducted on the player themselves. Later in the game, one of the variants says to Miles,
"How do you know you're not a patient?"
Now, this could be read as a line raising the possibility that Miles is being driven insane, just like the patients at Mount Massive, by the events of the game, which is true. However, it could also have the meaning that Miles is himself a patient being experimented on, and therefore so is the player, because as we just spoke of, Miles is a kind of stand-in for the player. Another line that indicates that the player is being experimented on occurs earlier in the game. When navigating the cell blocks, the player can hear one of the variants say this.
What's the experiment? The dead will perform on the living. I get your hint. It's still happening. The experiment is still happening.
This seems to indicate that though the Murkoff scientists are mostly dead, there is still an experiment taking place at that very moment. The last line that really drove this idea home for me occurs during the mail ward chase that happens about midway through the game, right before Traeger tricks you into getting into that dumbwaiter of his. This is possibly the most intense and terrifying scene in the game. You are running from the largest number of violent variants you've encountered up until this point, and as they chase you, the only thing that stands between them and you are the doors you have to close behind you, and the heavy objects that you have to slowly push in front of those doors while the patients gain distance on you. This place in the game is one where the player maybe feels the most helpless. While you are being chased, one of the variants shouts out,
"This is the experiment! This is the experiment! This is the experiment!"
Here, in a way, the variants shouting this gives us an answer to our question. What is the real experiment in Outlast? It seems to have something to do with this feeling of utter powerlessness as you are being chased throughout the asylum by vile, tormented monsters. What then is the experiment Red Barrels is performing on the player? Well, I don't think it is too different from what Murkoff is doing. Murkoff's hypothesis, as presented by Wernicke in the aforementioned exit interview, is that if they put the patients at Mount Massive through enough trauma, they will become suitable hosts for the Wall Rider. They will transform into the Wall Rider, this conglomeration of nanobots. Importantly, the character who the player controls and identifies closely with becomes a suitable host for the Wall Rider by the end of the game, transforms into it himself, has an apotheosis of sorts, becoming something that Father Martin mistook as a god. How does this connect to what I'm claiming Red Barrels is doing with their game? Well, what is Red Barrels' hypothesis then, and how does it connect to what Murkoff is doing? It seems it is something like this. If they, like Murkoff, put the player through a story filled with circumstances of great horror and trauma, circumstances where the player feels helpless, circumstances where the player is exploited by the powerful, they too might go through a transformation by the end of the game, akin to Miles' transformation as he turns into the Wall Rider. I think that through their game, Red Barrels wants the player to transform into someone who is more empathetic. They crafted the game the way they did so that the player might empathize with Miles Upshur, so that the player might empathize with the helpless victims of Murkoff scattered throughout Mount Massive Asylum. But, maybe more importantly, so that the player develops empathy for those powerless in the real world. Maybe because of the experiences one goes through playing the game, the player will remember what it feels like to be powerless and will thus empathize and seek to help out those who are down on their luck. Will seek to expose those who exploit the powerless, and will maybe even look at their own lives and choose to use whatever little power they might have for the good of others instead of for selfish and exploitative ends. Red Barrels, through their game Outlast, wants to transform the player, even if it's just a little bit, into a more empathetic person. And I think that is the real experiment in Outlast. So what do you guys think of my interpretation of the game? Am I spot on? Am I way off? Am I a crazy person that should be incarcerated in Mount Massive Asylum? Let me know in the comments, and please, if you like the video, don't forget to leave a like. Thanks for watching.